So Brian, thanks for joining us. I think one of the things that I've noticed a lot is sometimes people at the company will come over and ask you questions. Hey, by the way, is this true? You'll just roll your eyes. And I think what it showed me is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of misperceptions about some of these rules, both enacted and proposed. And so I thought it would just be good to quickly go through some of them, drill down, get into some of the details around them, because obviously sometimes it's not fact or fiction. It's a little bit gray in between. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so one of the things that's been said is that the EPA is going to be hiring satellites and flyovers to be looking for super emitters. True or not true?
Not true. The EPA, under the super emitter program, which is under Quad OOOb, they don't have the authority or the budget to hire satellites and airplanes to go look for super emitter events. What they will do is allow third parties who are approved using approved technologies to submit that data to the EPA to put on their website and to be able to require the operators to go through the process to mitigate those emissions. But the EPA themselves, they don't own a slew of satellites. They don't own a slew of airplanes. They're not going to be out there trying to report the super emitter program and hiring for that.
So to be clear, the EPA is not hiring planes and satellites to come look for your super emitters. All right, let's move on to the next one. You'll get fined for leaks found under the super emitter program.
Yeah, that's a good one. So under the super emitter program, it's really part of a performance standard, right? It's under the new source performance standards. If a super emitter is discovered and reported, the company is obligated under certain timeframes to mitigate those emissions and make sure they're gone. That doesn't mean that there's going to be a fine. A fine indicates that something is wrong, there's a penalty, and something needs to be addressed in an enforcement action. So if the company doesn't perform those responsibilities within the prescribed time frame or doesn't fix the leak, then certainly there could be an enforcement action and a fine or a penalty. Otherwise, it could potentially go under your Subpart W reporting and potentially be part of a methane waste emissions charge. So you could have to pay for it, but that's not really a fine or a penalty. I think the terminology is very important in how we use that. So it's not directly a fine as long as the company is responding as required in the rule.
Another one that you hear quite a lot is, hey, listen, I'm under 0.2 methane intensity. I'm 0.15 in 2023. None of this stuff will apply to me anyways.
If today was reality, then maybe it wouldn't. But there's a lot of changes coming. So Part W is going to change. So for your 2024 emissions, if you maintain that intensity below 0.2 for upstream anyway, for the production segment, then yes, it's unlikely that you will have to pay the waste emissions charge. However, Subpart W is changing. In a lot of cases, like we've talked before, emissions will increase without any change on a site just because of the new emissions factors and methodologies for estimating those emissions. So you might be under 0.2 today. You might not be for reporting year 2025 when Subpart W goes into effect. It's still a proposed rule. We don't have the final, but that's a realistic scenario for a lot of operators out there that your intensity is just going to increase just because of the rule change.
All right, another one, fact or fiction. Quad OOOb is going to take years to finalize.
True, it will take years to finalize. So from the federal perspective, right, Quad OOOb, it's a final rule. It should be published in the Federal Register any day now. So it will be a final rule, but the Quad OOOb is the emission guidelines for the states to implement those requirements. That part will take time. So each state has up to 2 years now. It was originally proposed 18 months, but now it's 24 months to get their plan into the EPA. And then EPA has 18 months to approve that plan and put it into effect. So it's going to take some time.
These Quad OOOb rules are finalized at the state level. If I'm an operator operating in an oil and gas friendly state, not as much for me to worry about, say, compared to California or Pennsylvania. Fact or fiction?
Fiction. There is a lot to worry about. I think given the Inflation Reduction Act and requirements to keep that rule as proposed in 2021, and there's some equivalency determination, a lot that goes behind that, every state is going to have to meet these Quad OOOb regulations, and EPA will have to approve it. They can copy and paste those regulations and keep them the same, or they can have their own set of regulations and prove equivalency. So there's a couple of ways to go about it, and a lot of gray area in between there, right? But everybody is going to have to meet the same requirements essentially for reduction of methane emissions through those rules.
So we already established Quad OC going to take years to play out and get finalized. So one thing that you hear is, hey, I'm not going to have to pay a waste emission charge, methane fee, until those rules are finalized. So I got years to worry about this.
Yeah, that's fiction. You're going to have to worry about it right away. The proposed rule does not allow for the exemption to take effect until the administrator has deemed that all the states have plans that are approved by the EPA and in effect. So we're thinking 2027, 2028 before that exemption would be applicable to anybody.
Fact or fiction? Companies will have to start reporting their inventories well site by well site rather than just at a basin level.
That is true in 2025. So for calendar year 2024, it's still under the existing Subpart W rule, which just requires basin-wide reporting, again, for the production segment and gathering and boosting segment for now. The proposed rule for 2025, which will go into effect January 1st next year, will require individual site-by-site reporting of those emissions under Subpart W.
Will those be publicly available or yet to be determined?
They will be publicly available. All emissions reported to the EPA are publicly available under the Subpart W program or any greenhouse gas reporting program for that matter. So those will be publicly available.
Fact or fiction? The EPA will have the right to audit a well site to confirm that the inventory is reported correctly.
Fact. Yep. And they do now. It's a little bit more complicated because it's reported up by basin. So sometimes it might be a little more challenging to drill down just from a data perspective. EPA always has the authority to go on any site anytime they want and evaluate data. Section 114 of the Clean Air Act allows them to also ask for any data essentially that they want to get from an operator. So that it exists today and it will continue to exist.
Approved continuous monitoring technology under Quad OOOb can replace the source level inventories under Subpart W. Fact or fiction?
Fiction. They cannot be replace the emissions reporting under Subpart W at this time. It would be important and I think valuable as empirical data to be able to provide that information to the EPA and be used, but at this time that cannot be used as part of your Subpart W reporting.
Similar, lots of people are signing up for OGMP 2.0. Measurement informed inventories will be allowed under the proposed Subpart W changes. Fact or fiction?
Fiction. That is also not allowed at this time. There are prescribed emissions factors and methodologies for calculating emissions for all sources under the Subpart W program. None of those include right now using a methane-informed inventory as would be done under OGMP 2.0 at this time.
Here's another one. These rules were hastily done, and therefore they can easily get rolled back under the Congressional Review Act.
Nothing's easy to get rolled back, I don't think. Given the time frame, so for Quad O, B, and C, it's unlikely that the Congressional Review Act will have any impact. They're going to be finalized soon enough. Once they're in the Federal Register, they're not going to meet that time frame. That's really like an August, September time frame, where if a rule is not finalized by that time frame, a new administration would have the opportunity under the Congressional Review Act to repeal any rules that were in effect or that were proposed.
So where does that put Subpart W then?
That's a good question. It depends on when Subpart W final rule comes out. So I anticipate this administration will try and get that out before August so that that's not at risk. But timing is getting tight. As with the waste emissions charge rule, it's getting very tight to get that kind of thing done through the federal process. It's lengthy.
Companies will be allowed to net their emissions across multiple basins to allow them to potentially not pay the waste emission charge.
That is true. There are quite a bit of stipulations in the proposed waste emissions charge rule for that. So for example, if you meet the regulatory exemption down the road when that's available, you can't use that basin where you meet that regulatory exemption to net out. So those become zero, they're not applicable, so you can't use that for netting. So there's a lot of other uniqueness with companies and how they roll up under umbrella companies and subsidiaries and things like that need to be worked through, and EPA has asked for that comment. But you will be able to net it, just the details still need to be worked out.
That's an interesting gaming it out type strategy, because you can imagine having a very low methane intensity basin, let's say in Appalachia, and it would actually be in your advantage not to have that exempt, so therefore it could net against something, let's say in the Permian.
I think you could argue that point, yes, where there could be an opportunity where that might be valuable to do. Yeah.
Get interesting.
It's an interesting approach.
Companies are not going to have to pay a methane fee in 2025?
Well, they will have to pay a methane fee in 2025 based on 2024 emissions, the way it stands under the Inflation Reduction Act and the waste emissions charge. That was put through in Congress. I don't think there's any exemption other than lawsuits or anything like that could delay that, of course. That's a whole nother side. But as it stands right now, they will be paying in 2025 for 2024 emissions.
Another one, this is a kind of getting down in the weeds, fact or fiction, an other large release event must be coming from a piece of equipment not already included in the emissions reporting.
Fact. Yep. So other large release events, which are those events which are greater than 100 kilograms an hour or 250 metric tons of CO2e under subpart W as proposed, it has to be from a source that's not already accounted for in subpart W reporting. So a blowdown, those are already reported under subpart W. If you have a compressor blowdown that exceeds that threshold, you would use that compressor blowdown methodology to calculate those emissions. It would not trigger another large release event or be classified as another large release event. Those are meant to capture things more like well blowout or some major failure that isn't accounted for under subpart W currently.
So blowout normally means loss of control, but what if you just have like a hole in one of your separators?
That could be, that would probably be another large release event if it exceeded those thresholds, because that's not something you would normally report. Hopefully you never report it, but that's not something that's normally accounted for. There's not an emissions calculation for that under subpart W for that kind of event.
Open thief hatch.
Open thief hatch would be calculated under the tank methodology.
Okay.
Yep.
So that one wouldn't fall into the bucket.
Correct.
Other large release event. Okay. So the last one of my favorites, is you hear companies and people say, this technology is already approved under Quad OB.
Yeah, fiction. There is no technology that's approved under Quad OB. You can't even apply for that approval now, and that won't be available until 60 days after the rule is published in the Federal Register. And then, of course, there's going to be a lengthy process to even get that approval working with the EPA. So, no, there are no approved technologies for Quad OB and C at this time.
So we're sitting here then, January 31st. So we're not really looking until April, so people can even apply.
Yes, it's probably going to be April. Depending on when it goes in the Federal Register, it's at least 60 days. And then up to 270 days for approval. So, we could be looking 9 months down the road, even after an application is submitted.
Cool. Well, appreciate you taking the time to go through this. Lots of facts, lots of fiction. So thanks for sorting through it.
Absolutely. Thank you.